Hello everyone, this is Leah Whitehorse from Leah Astrology, and this recording is all about Chiron in Aries. So Chiron is going to move into Aries on the 17th of April 2018. He will stay there until the 26th of September this year. So what we're going to be experiencing shortly is kind of like a preview of the main event to come. So on the 26th of September, Chiron will go back into Pisces and he will then re-enter Aries on the 18th of February 2019. And he will stay there up until the 19th of June 2026. He will then enter Taurus on that date. Then he will go back again into Aries on the 18th of September 2026. And then he will finally enter Taurus on the 14th of April 2027. So all of these dates, I will pop them in the information box below, whether you're listening to this on SoundCloud or whether you are listening to this on YouTube, so you can have all the dates there. So just for a bit of an introduction to Chiron. Chiron was discovered on the 1st of November 1977, an interesting date because in the Christian calendar this is All Saints' Day. It's the same year as the rings of Uranus were discovered as well. And the discovery Sabian of Chiron is the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. So a rainbow is often spoken of as a bridge between heaven and earth. And of course, another thing that we think of with rainbows, they are also associated with the idea of hope. The astrological glyph for Chiron is the key, and the letter K is included in this symbol, in this glyph. And the letter K actually stands for Cole, because it was Charles Cole, the astronomer, who discovered Chiron. The glyph itself was designed by an astrologer called Al Morrison. Chiron is a minor planet, but he is also classified as a comet, because he displays some of the characteristics of a comet. And he was the first of a new class of objects called centaurs in astronomy. Chiron has a highly elliptical orbit that crosses the orbits of Saturn and Uranus, linking the two together like a bridge. Its orbit is around 50 years. But centaurs have a highly unstable orbit. The gravitational pull of the planets is likely to alter the orbit of Chiron over time, so it may change its path or even leave the solar system altogether. Maybe Chiron is just a visitor. In mythology, Chiron is the wounded healer. Chiron, the word, is Greek for hand, and apparently it may also be rooted in the word for surgeon as well. Chiron was the son of Kronos. We know him as Saturn, and his mother was Philyra, and she was a nymph. And Kronos, Saturn, chased her in the form of a horse, and consequently caught up with her, and she gave birth to Chiron. And when he was born, he was half man, half horse. Philyra, his mother, was so disgusted at this, at the sight of Chiron, that she begged to be changed into anything that was like an inanimate object, so she wouldn't know the shame of giving birth to this creature. And she was turned into a linden tree. So Chiron was rejected by both mother and father, and so he was fostered by Apollo, And Apollo was great at many things, and he taught all of the things that he was talented at to Chiron, such as medicine and music, archery and prophecy. It's Chiron who is credited with the discovery of botany and pharmacy, and he is also skilled with herbs and medicine. Chiron was a centaur, but he wasn't like any of the other centaurs. The rest of the centaurs in mythology were kind of wild drinkers and violent. But Chiron, given his upbringing, he was skilled and educated and kind. And Homer in the Iliad said of him that he was the wisest and justest of all of the centaurs. Chiron himself taught many of the heroes in Greek mythology, such as Jason and Achilles and Perseus and Heracles. So he was a teacher and a mentor and a guide. He was a centaur, but he looked different to all of the other centaurs. According to the ancient Greeks, they show him as having the body of a horse, but he has the chest and the head of a man like other centaurs. But his forelegs are human. If you look at the pictures of other centaurs, all four of their legs are the legs of a horse. But Chiron had, I guess what they're trying to sort of say is a little bit more humanity because of having these front human legs. Many of us know that Chiron was injured during a battle with the centaurs. This battle was led by bad boy Nessus. Heracles was trying to fight them off, and he was shooting arrows that were dipped in the blood of the Hydra, and it was one of these that accidentally struck Chiron. Even though Chiron was an amazing healer, he couldn't heal himself. So because he was in so much pain, ultimately he willingly gave up his immortality to save the suffering of Prometheus. You might remember Prometheus as the guy who stole fire from the gods, and the gods weren't very happy about that, so they chained Prometheus to a rock where each day an eagle would feed upon his liver, and so he was going through this eternal torment. The only way that Zeus would allow Prometheus to be released was if someone else took his place. So this is where Chiron stepped in. Chiron did want to end his own suffering, but he was very moved by the suffering of Prometheus. So in the end, Zeus took pity on Chiron and placed him up in the skies as the constellation Centaurus. So the astronomy and the mythology give us a variety of themes that Chiron symbolizes in astrology. Because Chiron behaves very differently to other minor planets, we give him this title of a maverick. Mavericks, they tend to do their own thing. If we think about Saturn and Uranus, Saturn is very formal and kind of follows tradition, so he's doing what everyone's always done. And Uranus is kind of the rebel. He wants to do things differently to how they have always been done. But this maverick energy of Chiron is not interested in either of those positions. He simply does what he does. He's not influenced by the past or the future or what should be. The early story of Chiron in mythology suggests that something of this archetype is about shame, being conscious of physical difference. Sometimes Chiron can bring up issues connected to rejection. It can also bring up issues connected to where we feel we have a weakness or a scar. It may be a physical scar or an emotional, intellectual scar, and we can't heal it. We can't seem to do anything about it, so we have to find a way to learn to live with it. We have the story of duality with Chiron because he is half man, half horse. The horse, in fact, is part of his essential animal nature. So Chiron shows us something of how we too can bring ourselves together, how we can unite and heal the rift between our instincts and our intellect. He's a healer, he's a mentor, he's a guide, he's a teacher, he is the wounded one. He's a bridge builder, as I said before, with the rainbow Sabian symbol of his discovery. And also the fact that he links Saturn and Uranus. He is the key that unlocks our chart. He is holistic. Zane Stein, the astrologer who wrote an excellent book on Chiron called Essence and Application, A View from Chiron, he suggests that one of the key words for Chiron is quest. When I think of a quest, I think of a shamanic quest. And shamanism has always been a key word that I have used for Chiron because of the connection with half man, half horse. It makes me think about power animals. When I was doing my notes for this recording, when I got to this point, I was thinking about Lyra in Philip Pullman's Northern Lights, and all of the characters actually who have their kind of power animal that everybody can see. It's a big part of the story. And so out of interest, I cast Philip Pullman's chart. Unfortunately, we don't have a time of birth, but not surprisingly, he has his sun conjunct Chiron, so he incorporates Chiron energy into his identity, and Northern Lights is certainly a big part of his life. So we have this shamanic connection to Chiron. Chiron can talk of soul loss, and yet at the same time it's the part of us that needs to be reintegrated. It's like calling your soul back home. It's a missing piece of the puzzle. In mythology, one of Saturn's other names is Old Father Time. This is linked to the idea that the Greek Saturn was Kronos. Chronos, the word, is connected to chronological. It's how we measure time. 1 minute following the next minute, 1 hour following the next hour. This is chronological time. Saturn is concerned with the past and the security of tradition, as I mentioned earlier, and Uranus is concerned with the future. So we've got past and future, Saturn and Uranus. And yet Chiron, the one who crosses both of these orbits, he seems to be outside of time. Perhaps we could say that Chiron is concerned with cosmic time rather than human time. I was also thinking about how Saturn is connected to reality. We often use the word reality when we're talking about Saturn. And another word that we use with Uranus is awakening. So this made me think about how we go to bed after a hard day's work. The hard day's work is Saturn's thing. And then the following morning we wake up, we awaken with Uranus. But what happens in between? We dream, we sleep and we dream. So maybe Chiron is associated with this mysterious dream time. I'm sure some of you will have had dreams that seem to go on for days and days and days, and yet you've only been asleep for like 20 minutes. And so this made me think about how often I used to have dreams about my grandmother after my grandmother died. She used to come back kind of in spirit dreams and communicate to me what was happening to her in the spirit worlds. And one of those dreams in particular, she would talk about time, and she kept saying there is no time, and all time is now. And she kept repeating it to me. It was really fascinating. So This is the feeling that we get with Chiron, that he has something to do with cosmic time. There is also another kind of time that the ancients used to talk about, which is Kairos. And Kairos is connected to a moment in time where everything sort of comes together to create an opportunity for a right action, an opportune moment. Maybe if we think about combining that with Aries energy, feisty Aries energy, perhaps this Chiron in Aries transit is something about seize the day. Aries is a cardinal fire sign. It's a masculine sign. The ram, the symbol of Aries, is the one that provided the golden fleece in the mythologies. It's first of all the signs. It represents kingship and authority. Aries begins when the sun crosses the celestial equator, moving northwards. It marks the vernal or the spring equinox in the northern hemisphere. We call 0 degrees of Aries the Aries point, but we also call the 0 degrees of other cardinal signs Aries points as well, because they all mark the turning of the seasons. Cancer begins summer, Libra begins autumn, and Capricorn begins winter, again in the northern hemisphere. A planet crossing the Aries point, particularly at the 0 degrees of the sign Aries, this then marks a new season on a cosmic level. So Chiron moving into Aries is opening this new astrological season. Let's think of some of the associations with Aries. The key phrase is I am, I exist. The focus is on the self. Aries is personal. It's connected to leadership and independence, energy. It's assertive. Aries goes after what it wants. It's ruled by goal-setting, motivated Mars. It's sometimes confrontational. It's daring. It's courageous, impulsive. Aries gets things started. It's self-directed. It's fast. You've only got to think of the word spring, to spring into action. This gives us a feel of the sign Aries. It's headstrong. Just think of the ram lowering its horns, ready to ram into you. We talk about the word ram, ramming something home. It's not a sign that is associated with gentleness. It just gets things done. Because of Chiron's elliptical orbit, he stays in Aries much longer than any of the other signs. When he's in Libra, for example, it's only for a couple of years, but when he's in Aries, it's over 8 years. Perhaps then there's more work for Chiron to do in this sign. It's where we hurt the most. The need for personal, individual healing has a prime part to play in our overall collective healing. One of the ways that we can identify the themes of this Chiron in Aries transit is to look back at what happened in history when Chiron was travelling through Aries. So if we go back to 1918, the 1920s, we had Great Britain giving women the vote, as long as they were 30 and over. But anyway, they got the vote. And then that also happened in the US as well. So both of these were in 1918. So women were getting the vote. And then in the 20s, we had the roaring 20s and the flappers. Women were cutting their hair, shock horror. They were smoking and drinking and, in quotes, acting like men. Remember Aries, the masculine sign. But what, of course, they were really doing is challenging the sexual norms of the time. So this was the beginning of the first wave of feminism. Chiron was again in Aries in the 1970s. This was the me decade. It was a term coined by the novelist Tom Wolfe, and it referred to the growing prosperity of people, which gave them the opportunity to determine for themselves where they were going to take their lives. So we also had the gay pride marches. This was in 1970 on June 28, the very first gay pride marches in New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco. And of course, these two were challenging the sexual norms of the time. In October 1970, The Female Eunuch was published by Germaine Greer, and basically the 1970s were considered the second wave of feminism. So this historical kind of context shows us that we may well be exploring some issues perhaps connected to sexuality, sexual and gender identity. Perhaps we're also looking at the concept of the wounded masculine as well. Maybe as we come into this new season with Chiron in Aries, we're looking at the third wave of feminism as the Me Too movement explodes. And in Britain, we've just had this situation where companies have been, for the first time ever, legally required to publish their figures which show the gender pay gap. So I think this is going to be a big thing as we move into Chiron in Aries. Something else that I noted when I was going through the historical references is that in 1920, we had the first American superhero film, and superheroes are very much an Aries affair. Aries is associated with leadership. So we've got the Mark of Zorro. That was the first ever superhero film. Now, what does Zorro do? He cuts the faces of evildoers. He scars them with his mark, the Z that's cut out onto their face. Interesting, because Aries and Mars rules the head and the face. And of course, Chiron is connected to scars. In 1922, we had the first ever vampire film, Nosferatu. It was released in Germany. And so we've got another kind of superpower here, a creature of super strengths. Often we associate vampires with sex and death. Mars, the ruler of Aries, is also the ruler of Scorpio. And of course, then there's the blood, the red blood, like the red planet. Another little aside here is that the company who produced Nosferatu, they were called Prana Films. Prana is the life force. It's connected to breath. Aries too is connected to the life force and the first breath taken at birth. So perhaps then these two archetypal characters, Zorro and Nosferatu, capture something of the nature of this transit of Chiron in Aries. Will we be brave and fight the evildoers, figuratively marking them so they are visible to everyone? Or will the me first nature of Aries fall into bleeding others dry for their own selfish ends? Chiron in Aries may bring up issues in the collective connected to heroes and anti-heroes. Who are we looking to lead us? Who will lead? Who will follow? In natal astrology, some say that Chiron in the first house or in Aries is associated with gurus and spiritual leaders. Perhaps this too will be a time when we see a rise in this kind of phenomena. With the ruler of Aries, Mars, known as our inner warrior, we may be looking at the archetype of the wounded soldier. There may be more that we're hearing about vets, about military personnel, about the injuries inflicted both inwardly and outwardly due to conflict. Mars, the ruler of Aries, also rules guns and ammunition, so we can be sure that that story about gun violence in the US and the changes needed to heal from that's not going away anytime soon with Chiron moving through Aries. When Chiron was travelling through passive Pisces, we may have felt like we couldn't do anything about global or personal suffering. Chiron in Pisces has been very much about finding acceptance, finding peace despite our pain, transcending to another level, finding meaning in suffering, healing by retreating, or just simply feeling defeated by the pain. Chiron moving into dynamic Aries, though, says the way to healing is to do something, to take action, to get motivated. Healing occurs when we are brave, when we face challenges head on and confront the source of the problem. We are looking at the first house of the mundane chart, and this part of the chart is associated with how we look physically. So Chiron's entry here might mean that disability rights also gain more prominence, thinking of the fact that obviously Chiron was a half man and half horse, and he was rejected for how he looked. So we've got this sense then that we're now needing to go beyond first impressions. Chiron will help us perhaps to be less focused on just what we look like. I was thinking about selfies, and maybe Chiron in Aries will be about showing the real person, because to be honest, Aries just doesn't have time to take like 46 photos from every different angle just to pick the right one to put onto Facebook. Aries is snap it and done. So Chiron in Aries may really help us to accept how we look, whatever our physical circumstances. With all of these possibilities come the shadow and the pain and the suffering. The more challenging aspect of Chiron in Aries flips all of the healing potential on its head. Our wounds could be exposed as a lack of motivation and unwillingness to act. The source of pain could be connected to feeling unable to set goals or being too aggressive about what we want. Aries is associated with vigour and fast developments, but especially at the beginning of this transit, we may feel like the new growth that we're witnessing is very fragile. Perhaps we feel disappointed that our efforts don't seem to be paying off. Maybe the inner pain that we've been experiencing has meant that we've been putting our energies into the wrong thing and going in the wrong direction. Sometimes Chiron in Aries means that everything feels like a fight and we feel tired, the sort of lack of energy. Maybe we're feeling more sensitive to our weaknesses, and perhaps we have to spend some time repairing the dents in our armour. We do, however, have to be very conscious of where we are trying to just make a fast fix to a problem. Sometimes it's good to patch things up and to just keep going. But if we don't address our wounds and our issues properly, then they are going to resurface later down the line. So we need to focus on the healing rather than just constantly keeping going. I mentioned before that one of the keywords of Aries is associated with the self and individuality. So this can bring up issues connected to existence. Remember before I said Aries is I am, I exist. Just existing can seem painful. Chiron in Aries can bring up issues connected to self-harm. not just the kind that involves razor blades, but subtle self-harm as well, the harsh words you might shout to yourself privately, or the way you hold yourself back because you don't think you're worthy or strong enough, or the way you keep pushing because you think you have to prove how strong you are, even though you feel broken inside. Chiron will bring up the need to remedy this. Melanie Reinhardt says we may wound ourselves through militant self-sufficiency. Chiron in Aries will help to heal those aspects of ourselves that impinge upon our independence, but will also teach us that we don't have to do it all alone. I mentioned before about how Aries is connected with goals. It's about going after what we want. It's full of desire. Do you remember saying when you were a child, I want, and then it was followed with your mother or your father or your caretaker saying, I want never gets. My mother used to tell me that all the time. I have Chiron in Aries. So sometimes deep down, we think that we can't have what we want, that we're not allowed what we really want. And to even admit to what we want is painful. We procrastinate, or we don't know what to do because we're really afraid of doing anything that says, I have a right to be here. Sometimes we're terrified that we'll get what we want because it'll be taken away from us. As a natal Chiron in Aries person, that's a fear that I have lived with throughout my life. The problem is that sometimes exactly that happens because we're wanting the wrong things. We've negated ourselves so much that we're just wanting what everybody else wants, but it doesn't work for us on an individual level. So the universe takes away what we achieved. We have to heal what has been damaged and hurt inside to understand what we truly want that is in alignment with our inner divine spark. And on the flip side, whilst Chiron is going through Aries, sometimes we'll also perhaps need to learn that we can't have everything that we want. We're learning about how to be a good loser and also how to be a healthy winner. I'm going to end this recording with a poem. The following poem I'm about to read to you comes from The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. This book was published in 1923 under Chiron in Aries. Khalil Gibran himself had a grand trine with Chiron, Mercury and Uranus, showing us that he had a gift of higher understanding when it comes to pain and suffering, which he then shared with us through his writing. Your pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses your understanding. Even as the stone of the fruit must break, that its heart may stand in the sun, so must you know pain. And could you keep your heart in wonder at the daily miracles of your life, your pain would not seem less wondrous than your joy. And you would accept the seasons of your heart, even as you have always accepted the seasons that pass over your fields. And you would watch with serenity through the winters of your grief. Much of your pain is self-chosen. It is the bitter potion by which the physician within you heals your sick self. Therefore trust the physician and drink his remedy in silence and tranquility. For his hand, though heavy and hard, is guided by the tender hand of the unseen, and the cup he brings, though it burns your lips, has been fashioned of the clay which the potter has moistened with his own sacred tears. I hope you have found this recording helpful. If you're interested in learning more about your own Chiron, I do now have a new reading on my website entitled All About Your Chiron, which is an in-depth exploration of your natal chart, Chiron, looking at the aspects and the Sabian symbol, house and sign and so on, and also looking at the Chiron cycles as well as the Chiron return. If you enjoy my work, then you might also like to check out my Patreon page. I do write extra posts, especially for my patrons. All of the links to the special Chiron reading and also to Patreon I will provide below. Thank you very much for listening.